In this session, we are joined by Ms. Dites. Dites is the Silent and Myanmar Campaigns Director for International Rivers, a global NGO working to defend the rights of rivers and communities for 16 years. Pai has actively worked to protect Southeast Asia's major rivers, the Mekong and Salween. A pioneer in her work with Thai and Burmese ethnic grassroots organizations, she organizes river communities to slow down dam projects along the Salween River that threaten the local ecosystem and the livelihoods of those who depend on the river and its resources. Ms. Dites forms community action groups to push for long-term policy and legislation that includes the participation in risk analysis of development projects. Thank you, Pai, for joining us today. We are so glad to have you on our panel. My first question to you would be, could you tell us a little bit more about the connection of the Karen people to nature and its relevance for them, the traditional laws which are there and how they connect to the area? How does cow and other elements of culture relate to their connection with nature and land?
Good evening, everybody. Nice to see all of you here in this session. To the question, I would say that from my experience working with the current ethnic communities or indigenous people in the Salween Basin, I would say that they've been living, they believe that their ancestors live in the Salween Basin for more than 1,000 years. But because of the simple kind of way of life that they don't really have construction or cities or big towns, so that they live only in the forest. I would say that they are the current indigenous people of the Salween Basin. They are purely forest dweller. They are the one who live in the forest. They farm in the forest, in the jungle, in harmony with nature, and they do not destroy the forest at all. So there is very little evidence to show that they actually live there for more than 1,000 years. But everywhere we go, we can see that abundant large forest, particularly the teak forest in the Salween Basin, being protected very well by the local communities of the current ethnic. And from my experience working with them, taking the field work, interviewing them and spending time with women groups, students, youth, and elders, my experience is that the way of life and the belief of the current indigenous people living in the Salween and along Thai Burmese border, they very much respect the forest and the Mother Earth, the nature. They feel that actually it's them that belong to the forest. Actually, it's their livelihoods that belong to the earth. So everything they do has been very much in respect to the Mother Earth and Mother Nature. For example, when they do the rotational agricultural farming, before they cut the woods, they would pray and inform the Mother Earth that they are going to start the cultivation. They're going to start cutting some of the woods to make the place for them to grow their rice and other crops. So this kind of ritual been going on for the whole year. So most of that time they very much attached to the river, and as well as to respect the Salween River as well as other tributaries.
That is so interesting, and that is also similar to some of the practices we have in this region. My second question to you would be that the saying, land does not belong to people, people belong to the land, seems to be true in the case of the Salween Peace Park. Could you tell us a little bit more about the way that the current people interpret this and how it is enacted in their connection with nature? How do people envision their own well-being within these aspects?
I think the majority of population of the world this day, they might define the word of the well-being as a prosperity or richness or lots of material, lots of good phones, good internet, or good housing and travels. But from my experience spending with my colleagues and my comrades with the current indigenous people in the Salween Basin, I would say that for them, what they really see as well-being or precious thing for them is actually peace to live with nature, particularly in the eastern part of Myanmar when there's been under the ongoing conflicts for many decades, particularly this year after the coup in Myanmar that power and democracy were taken by the military junta. So what is very luxurious for them is actually peace. They want peace. So they want freedom to be able to practice their indigenous way of livelihoods, to be with the land that they belong to. For the past 20 years, there has been attempt by hydropower industry together with government officials and some government authorities in Thailand, China, and in Myanmar to develop large hydropower dams along the Salawin River on the mainstream. And at least 3 of them were planned to be built on the current state of Myanmar. So that's how people got together and discuss and say that they need to use their own wisdom, local wisdom, to protect the land and protect the forest from armed conflict, as well as from destructive hydropower construction. To my understanding, this is how they formed and how they declared Salawin Peace Park in this on the bank of the Salawin River in current state.
So moving on, the third question which I wanted to ask you is, what are the aspirations of the community for the future in terms of the park, their land, and the river? Going forth, how does the community envision development for the regions?
As the area has been under ongoing armed conflict for many decades, I think what people there envision is to see the future of their land, the future of their next generation that live in peaceful way. There is no more militarization by Burmese army. There is no more planned destructive dams project on the Salawin River, and the way that they can see the forest managed and used with local wisdom of the current indigenous people. I think that's the thing they're looking forward to see. And the importance of the forest for them is not just beautiful forest to take a walk, but for them it's like meaning death or life, meaning that how they can find food, how they can find woods, mushroom, edible plants, just to surviving while they are sick, they are hiding from the militarization, from the armed conflict in eastern Myanmar. So for me, the appreciation for me to the Salawin Peace Park is that the way that people are not leaving their homeland, they want to be there and they want to protect their land, and they feel the sense of the belonging, that they are the one that belong. They are children of the forest and they are children of the rivers. So their deed is to protect this land and to protect this river, even though I think that in the modern day, you can see them as a poor villagers that have less or even no income at all, but they can still live peacefully with their land and their forest. And
thank you, Pai. Yes, what you're speaking about is something that I think the audience in the Northeast can also relate to, because we have a lot of communities which have this similar feeling towards the forest. Today, we are joined by Amanda Janu. Amanda is the Knowledge and Policy Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. She's an economic policy expert, and her work aims to build just and sustainable economies through goal-oriented and participatory policy design processes. Thank you, Amanda, for joining us today. We are so glad to have you on our panel. My first question to you would be, successful economic growth and well-being are generally seen as opposed to each other, as the former is structured around infinite growth. How do you work with the challenge of reconciling the two? While this is possible, there are structures which inhibit this, as well-being is often seen as holding back on the n number of possibilities. How do you work on creating a space for both?
Such an important question, because I think it really brings us down to the fundamental issue of what the purpose of the economy is. Because the economy is ultimately just a word that we use to describe the way we produce and provide for one another. And so it's an activity, it's a means, it's a way in which we try to improve our quality of life. And so theoretically, there shouldn't be any conflict between economic growth and well-being. But the problem is that somewhere along the way, we really started to confuse means and ends, where we started to evaluate our economy's success by the level of wealth that is generated through producing goods or providing services to one another, rather than the level of well-being that is generated through those activities. And so this has led to a situation where we now treat people and planet as if they're here to serve the economy, rather than recognizing the reality that it's here to serve us. And so the Wellbeing Economy movement is really founded in that recognition, and it really advocates for designing and evaluating our economies by their contribution to human and ecological well-being. So this really means, when we have GDP growth as our aim, we have ended up encouraging and rewarding large corporations or investors or entrepreneurs that are really viewed as the most efficient at generating profits and wealth that are important for GDP. But once we flip the script and we really say, well, actually, it's about well-being, and that's really our vision of progress, and that's what matters most, then we start to think about different kinds of economic activities and behaviors that are really, really important and efficient at generating well-being, for example. And so this is where we will start to see that our work as caregivers or artists or stewards of the earth as really valuable, because these are the economic activities that are directly contributing to social and ecological well-being. And so therefore, I think it's not so much a question of growth, but rather growth of what and why.
Thank you, Amanda. That was a very, very satisfactory and interesting take. So going to the next question, like it's almost an extension of what you were speaking about, as those who are in the global south and have a repository of traditional knowledge and ways of life which are contrary to the somewhat universal, somewhat Eurocentric ways of understanding well-being, how do you and the organization work around the challenge of creating the discursive disruption needed for decolonial ways of seeking growth? What are the challenges that you face in doing so, if there are any?
I mean, this is actually honestly a question that is so pertinent for me. I worked in international development for over a decade, so working across Asia and Africa in particular. And I just moved back to the United States, where I'm from, this past year. And one of the things that has been so striking for me is the level of anxiety and depression here. So I know that it's spreading worldwide, but there's something just so deep inside in this system that, you know, we're supposedly the richest, most successful country in the world, but it's making us miserable. Yeah. And everybody feels like it's their fault, that they need to work harder or exercise more or meditate more, you know, in order to alleviate that. But when so many people are feeling this and it's pervasive throughout the society, then you realize there's something really problematic about the way that we've built this system that is actually infecting, you know, our hearts and our souls. And so now, having shifted from working in international development to now working in the well-being economy movement, it is very much currently being driven by countries and communities in the global north. And I think there's a good reason for this, right? Because I think countries such as mine, although the well-being economy movement is not strong enough yet here, but it, you know, in very high income countries, they are experiencing this existential crisis, right? Where they have built economies and societies that are really good at generating wealth, but it's making them miserable, right? And the planet is on fire and we all have to stand 6 feet apart from one another. And so there's this question of like, what is all of this for? And so I do feel that the majority of the responsibility does need to be held by the global north, because they have built this system, right? And they do need to transform it in order to develop alternative visions and structures and narratives for global development. But I think really critically, and to your point, I do not believe that the blueprints for that better system are going to come from the global north, but rather from the global south, because it's not an issue of just technical fixes. It's ultimately a cultural one of how do we want to live together on this planet? How do we want to interact and connect with one another? How do we want to provide for one another? And I think that the examples that we're going to find that are really going to help societies like mine to find again some peace and some connection and some meaning and purpose is going to come from reconnecting, I think, to a lot of those traditional cultural understandings and ways of living together.
I think at this point, one of the most important questions that we deal with, right? So going to the next one, as a policy expert, what would you consider are the main requirements when we envision sustainable economies based on the idea of well-being?
So I think there's maybe two different parts to this. So one is, what does an economy that is like a sustainable economy based on well-being really look like, right? And so that's, and then the other part is, you know, what are the prerequisites for policy in order to sort of shape and mold and build such an economy? And so first of all, and I think probably very, you know, is we need our economy to be regenerative by design, right? So if this is about producing and providing for one another, we need to recognize that if every single thing around us, right, has been produced and given from the earth, then we have a responsibility to give back, right? And so we need to build an economic system where we are giving as much as we are taking, not only to one another, but to our natural environment as well, and to use our creative energies and our, our time and our ingenuity in order to really revitalize our natural world. And importantly, it also needs to be pre-distributive. We're in a system right now where we try to grow our economy so we can take some of that wealth through taxes to try to fix some of the damages that are done to people and planet in the process, right? And it's not a very efficient way of doing this, as opposed to really thinking about the fact that when we're producing things together or we're working together in collaboration, how do we ensure that there's fair distributions of voice, of power, and of the wealth and the opportunities that come from that collaboration, so that the economic enterprise through cooperatives or social enterprises, there's a lot of different ways in which we can collaborate without there being exploitation of each other or perceived ownership of one another. And I think those are some of the prerequisites. But when we think about policy is really the way in which we influence our behavior, through collective decisions about what kinds of behaviors we want more or less of. And so we're in this really amazing moment, I think, where we're experiencing this paradigm shift, right? Where people are really awakening and questioning what matters in the world. And so when there's some really great statistics, for example, which I'll just talk about very quickly, right? So one is, in 2 years ago, in 2020, there was a survey that illustrated that over half of the world believes that capitalism is doing more harm than good right now. And in India, that's actually was up at, I think, 74%, right? So a lot of people really recognize that there's a problem with our current economic system. But then just this past year, like in 2021, there was another survey that illustrated that in the G20 countries, the countries that are supposed winners of this whole system, right? Nearly 3/4 of people want their national economic priorities to move beyond profit and growth, to really prioritize the well-being of people and, ecological protection. So that's a shift from not just recognizing a problem to seeing the solution, right? And so the will is there, the recognition is there, but what we need are more participatory methods of decision making, right? Because if we just wait and vote and wait for other people to sort of make these decisions for us, then that's, not going to be sufficient. I think we need the agency. And so this is about governance reform, revitalizing democracy, providing spaces through citizens' assemblies and community discussions, forums, participatory budgeting, all of these things where our voices, we can feel we have a power over the shape and form of the economy. And I think the other prerequisite, which is a tough one, is really about a mindset shift, where right now government almost always starts from a problem-based approach, right? So we look and we try to see what the problem is and we try to fix it, right? And we think about, okay, well, here's the problem and what are we lacking that is causing this problem? As opposed to starting with a strength-based approach of what do we value and what do we really want to achieve and what's already existing within our society that can be the foundation and be built upon in order to grow and achieve that. And in some way, that's sort of like the deficit to abundance mindset shift, but it's also really just about the processes by which we make decisions and the things in which we look at as the foundations for the better world we envision. And so those are some of the prerequisites, I'd say, for a well-being economy.
With that, our interview comes to an end. Thank you, Amanda, so much for joining us. It was such a pleasure to have you on our panel. And thank you for answering us in so much of detail. It was very, very interesting to listen to you.
Oh, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure.
Today, we are joined by Julie Stein. Ms. Stein is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Wildlife Friendly Enterprise Network, an initiative for certifying rural enterprises that assure people and nature coexist. Thank you, Julie, for joining us today. We are so happy to have you with us again. So without further ado, I will get right to the first question. Can you tell us a little bit more about how wildlife-friendly certification helps communities achieve their ideas of well-being?
Thank you so much for including me this year, and I'm so sorry not to be able to be there in person, but very happy to be able to participate this way. So my organization is the Wildlife Friendly Enterprise Network. We are a certification program, but we really use certification as a tool to both get conservation done and to support community livelihoods and community well-being. So I really appreciate this question. And so while our branding, sort of focuses on the wildlife aspect for consumers, human communities have always been very equal in that scale for us. And so one of the things we do, we recognize that both people and wildlife need to survive and thrive in these high biodiversity landscapes, and that people really hold, these local communities hold the future of wildlife in their hands, and they're really taking all the risk by living next to wildlife. Often consumer agricultural products are far away in urban centers and don't necessarily understand all of the issues that rural communities are facing. So what we do is try to give wildlife a value while it's still alive for local communities, and make sure that's really transparent, that any benefits or increases that they perceive in their well-being are tied to wildlife alive rather than, for example, being sold for their parts in the illegal wildlife trade. And we do this by creating incentives and letting global consumers and companies carry some of the risk for those communities living next to wildlife. Sometimes these benefits or increases in well-being from being part of our network and certified by us are, sometimes they're a premium on the price of the product. Sometimes it's in gaining access to new markets. Sometimes it's in consumer loyalty over a long time because they appreciate the stories behind these products. Sometimes the NGO that is local and supporting that community is able to provide improved infrastructure or training, sometimes training for diversification of income, which, as we know, is really important these days. And in other cases, they might be able to help with complementary certifications like organic practices, for example. And all of this really helps with human and ecosystem health and resilience, which in this time of climate change and COVID is so important.
Thank you, Julie. That was very eloquent. So what do you consider to be the pillars or prerequisites of human and ecology interdependent sustainability?
We really want to think about envisioning a world where each thing we buy is leaving the world a better place instead of doing harm. And instead of just doing no harm, we want to move beyond that. We want to reach beyond that because we have to at this stage, both for climate and the biodiversity crisis. And I don't know about in India, but in the US, the word regenerative, it's sort of being used a lot, and there are a lot of competing definitions. So it's hard to know if you're talking about the same thing these days when you use the word regenerative, almost like the word sustainability. It's a little vague, but we do need to look at practices that regenerate and sustain our resources rather than degrade or destroy them. We're looking at circularity and closing loops in production, and of course, giving our work a little plug, wildlife friendly approach, organic production wherever there's agriculture. And this is really important because agriculture covers over a third of the Earth's surface, land surface now. So it's both one of the biggest challenges and biggest opportunities for biodiversity, which of course is our focus. So when I say biodiversity, I'm including humans in that biodiversity. And I just wanted to touch on one more thing, because I know naturenomics is one of Balapara's pillars, as it is ours. And one of the new tools that's out there thinking about business and the role that business might play in meeting the global goals for nature and how companies can start engaging and where companies should start. There's some new tools, and one of them is the science-based targets for nature, which are initial guidance for business on biodiversity and really emphasizing a no regrets approach. So acting even if we don't have full information and taking a precautionary approach so that actions taken by business are erring on the side of protecting nature and communities. I'm including communities in that nature definition. So the shorthand are the SBTs, the science-based targets, and these are actionable. And there's a framework, it's called AR3T, and that stands for avoid, reduce, regenerate, restore, and transform. So this is really a framework that can help businesses start doing the actions that they want to take, and then eventually start thinking about measuring those, but you don't need to be able to measure to start thinking about acting. So I just wanted to touch on those in case they're not well known to the Balapara audience. It's still in development, but if you Google science-based targets for nature, you can see the framework that's starting to be developed. It's very interesting, and it might be something of interest for. So not only are we looking for win-wins, we're looking for win-win-win-wins. We're looking for, the community to benefit, the landscape to benefit, biodiversity to benefit, and companies and consumers to benefit. So that's a high bar. And in reality, there will be some trade-offs, but one of the things we need to think about is sort of, instead of seeing a pie and cutting it in half and saying wildlife gets half, we need to start looking at where the overlaps are and really expanding the pie. So there's common ground always, and that's one of the things we need to look at, so that when we do make trade-offs, they're the best possible trade-offs. I think from my perspective, it's not an either or decision, it's a both and, that we really need to do both, and that each particular site will sort of, once you dig down to see the ecological and social context there, will tell you what needs to happen on that site. So whether you're talking about this 30 by 30, which is protecting 30% of the planet by 2030, or 50 by 50, which is a much higher bar, we need to protect the best and improve the rest. And we need to do that as quickly as possible. So I think because of where the world is right now, yes, there will be trade-offs, but we need to make the smartest trade-offs we can. I guess the other thing is, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot recently is that we all are climate refugees now, basically. And so we all need to move to survive, and that's people and wildlife. So there are going to be winners and losers for people and wildlife. There'll be some serious environmental justice issues over land tenure, and as with climate changing, where people can actually still live, where wildlife and people can actually still live and survive. So if you can't move, there are maybe dire consequences. And so that's another one of those examples where we can't really, the trade-offs are too serious. So we've got to find a way to expand the pie and avoid those trade-offs. And all of this, I guess I need to acknowledge, is going to require big shifts. It's no longer business as usual. The future is going to require transformational change, because change is going to be really the only constant in our life right now. I was listening to an Israeli historian, his name is Yuval Noah Harari, and he was saying one of the most critical skills we're all going to need looking ahead in the future is to be able to reinvent ourselves over and over again, and not only to learn things, but to unlearn things that we already know. And that really hit me. I think it's true, and it's going to apply to us as individuals, but also to our organizations and to brands, business, and everybody. So I'll just pause there, but I think that's an important message that we all need to think about going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of our audience would actually relate to what you said about Yuval Noah Harari, because I think that's one book that that's kind of the book of this century. So I think that's a very nice note to end on. So thank you. We only have time for that for now. Thank you so much for joining us this year, and we hope to see you again next year.
Thank you so much. And hi to all my friends that I hope are in the room, and maybe next year I will be able to see you in person. Take care and be safe, everyone.